Everybody, my name is Natalie Yeadon, and I'm the CEO and co-founder of Impetus Digital. At Impetus Digital, we've built some of the best-in-class asynchronous and synchronous virtual collaboration tools for life science companies to use across the globe. We actually help people with everything from virtual advisory boards, medical education events, publication groups, investigator meetings. We even do things through the Insight Events platform that we just launched for large corporate events, sales training, and everything in between. But most importantly, we really believe at Impetus that everything starts with a conversation. And with these big, hairy, audacious conversations that we have with digital provocateurs, thought leaders, leading edge thinkers, entrepreneurs, is that we can all work to collectively and positively disrupt healthcare. But we believe that it doesn't just start and end with a single conversation. These conversations need to continue. They need to fuel each other. We need to build authentic partnerships. And this is exactly what we do on the Impetus Insight platform by having a series of asynchronous and synchronous discussions, insight sharing, and collaboration so that we can really blow the socks off new ideas and generate new consensus. So I'm really excited to have one of these leading edge thinkers at the table with me today. This is actually Seth Rotberg. He is actually a patient advocate. He's a community connector, as well as a motivational speaker who is really passionate about bringing his personal experience to support the health community. His passion is driven actually by a very sad story. His mother actually had a 17-year battle with Huntington's disease, and we're going to talk a little bit about that. This is actually a rare genetic disease. And in 2019, Seth co-founded the nonprofit Our Odyssey. This was actually done in order to provide year-round social and emotional support to young adults who are impacted by some of these rare or chronic conditions. Seth actually holds a master's degree in nonprofit management from DePaul University, and he also is currently residing in Cambridge, Massachusetts. Professionally, he works as the patient leader recruitment manager at WeGo Health. So welcome, Seth. So happy to have you on the show today.
Yeah, happy to be here. Happy to kind of dive into the conversation and, start talking about how we put the patient at the center of the healthcare space.
I love it, Seth. So I really want to spend a couple of minutes, and, obviously how deep you want to go personally or not, but yeah. A lot of the people who listen to our show are in the pharmaceutical life science space. Patient advocates and patients in general are taking a huge role in everything that we and they do. So tell us a little bit about the journey that you have navigated in order to get you to where you are today.
Yeah, I mean, I'll do my best to sum it up. I feel like that could be a whole conversation in itself, but my journey has been over 15 years now, and it started when I was about 15 years old. That's when my mom was first diagnosed with Huntington's disease, but with a lot of different rare diseases, there tends to be a misdiagnosis. And so leading up to that, my mom was misdiagnosed with bipolar disorder, with these mood swings, major depression. And I think it was very challenging for my family and I because, again, we didn't know what was going on. We didn't understand why she was acting different, why she had poor balance and wobbly movements, why people thought she might have been drinking during the day. There were a lot of unknowns to her, the way she was acting. And eventually, once getting that diagnosis, you go to what most people do, which is you go to Dr. Google and you start searching, you start kind of going down somewhat that rabbit hole of what is this disease and what are the symptoms? Are there any effective treatments? Is there a cure? And I think the two things that kind of stood out to me was that there was no cure or effective treatment. And then the other part was that once being diagnosed, the average lifespan is about 10 to 20 years. And so, as mentioned, kind of in that introduction, my mom battled this for 17 years of my life, majority of my life. She passed away about 6 years ago and is no longer suffering, is at peace. But, when you watch your loved one go through that for such a long time, it makes you kind of appreciate the little things in life. But then knowing that I had a 50-50 chance of inheriting this was a whole nother kind of thing I had to think about. And honestly, I felt alone because even though I had my friends and family for support, it was, being a high school kid, right? Or even just someone, a young adult in general, trying to fit in with my peers in society, not trying to feel judged, trying to just be myself. And it was tough because I had to adjust to this new normal. And so, knowing all that, I eventually decided I wanted to go through genetic testing at the age of 20. And, keep this in mind that in the US, there's over 40,000 Americans who live with Huntington's disease, another 200,000 at risk. And research says only about 10 to 15% actually go through testing. It's a very personal decision. And on top of that, one of the reasons could be there's no effective treatment. So why learn about what your future holds? But for me, I wanted to learn that. I wanted to know, how could I prepare for what might be ahead in my kind of health journey? And so I went through the testing process at the age of 20, and I found out I tested positive for this disease. And really what that means is I'm guaranteed to get this and end up one day like my mom, unless there's an effective treatment or cure. So I'm right now racing against time and trying to figure out, how much time do I have left until I start showing symptoms? Will there be enough time to, build a family and not necessarily be sick by the time I have that family? Because my mom, again, was sick most of my life. So a lot of my memories are when she was sick. And so I don't want the same for a future family. So, two options when you find out about any diagnosis, it's the fight or flight, right? Hey, I don't want to do anything. I don't want to deal with this, or I want to get more involved. And I decided I wanted to get involved with fundraising, advocacy, volunteer efforts, taking on different leadership roles, and really just trying to share my story with others. But to kind of fast forward to my career path piece of it, is I studied sport management in undergrad. I'm a big sports fan in the Boston area. And I was always a fan of like wanting to mix sports with community outreach, right? Using the power of sports to teach life lessons. Well, that didn't necessarily pan out. Went into kind of the education system in the nonprofit sector, went back to grad school, but then in 2018, did a TEDx talk on my story. And that's when I shifted into this healthcare space as a career, because I said, wow, I have a story to share, but there's thousands or even millions of other people who also have a story they may want to share and may feel alone right now. So how can I help them navigate the next steps in their journey as they're trying to figure all of this out?
Fantastic. What a great story, Seth, and really, truly brilliant. And obviously, there's a lot to dig in there. And I just want to spend a couple of moments before we start talking about misdiagnosis and how people are getting diagnosed, et cetera. And I want to double click on that for a little bit. But before we do that, let's talk a little bit about the launch of our Odyssey. You launched that actually only a few years ago. Tell us a little bit about what the vision and mission of our Odyssey is. What's your role? What is your team's role in really the objectives of this and the people that you're working with?
Yeah, so it's actually interesting, because when I went to grad school to get a master's in nonprofit management, one of the first things they tell you is why not to start a nonprofit. And then I did the exact opposite. And honestly, I didn't think I was going to do this, but I saw that there was this need, and understanding this unmet need of just how to navigate, life with a rare chronic condition as a young adult, specifically ages 18 to 35, whether it's transitioning into college, navigating your career, family planning, dating, right? The list goes on. And, we just wanted to find, as a young adult, you want to fit in with your peers and find that sense of belonging. And what I learned was that, the unmet needs of young adults were often being overlooked in the health community. And although there is, your national conferences or events and you connect with people, after a few weeks, you kind of return to your everyday lives and you might become disconnected from your peers and resource and support. So we're like, let's do something. Let's, provide this year-round support to empower, educate, and connect young adults to one another through kind of this peer-to-peer support aspect of things. And so our mission is to connect young adults impacted by a rare chronic condition with social emotional support in the hope of improving their quality of life. And really our vision is to, establish an organization that provides that empowerment and education and connection piece for young adults who are experiencing health challenges. And that's exactly what we're doing. In 2019, we started with this concept of like in-person meetups, an opportunity for young adults to connect, network, and just feel, that sense of belonging again. And it was really cool because we did that in 2019 in DC and in Philly. And we were able to get one more in Boston at the beginning of 2020, right before the pandemic. But we were always planning on doing virtual meetups. We shifted fully focused on that because of COVID-19. And it's, looking back, we were able to, put together about 36 virtual meetups last year. And it's a lot. And we also realized, we were able to, serve over 460 young adults in 2020. And to date, serve or connect with young adults from 4 countries, 33 US states, representing over 130 different rare chronic conditions. Now we're doing all this as me being a full-time volunteer, having an amazing board, having amazing volunteers as well. And then we have 1 part-time staff member. So, the goal is, how do we obtain funding to continue to build out capacity, continue to grow, continue to improve the quality of lives of young adults who just want to, have their voice heard, but also feel a part of something, a part of a community.
You're also a recruiter for people like yourself to do other things like you're doing, to become speakers and mentors and advocates and what have you within the WeGo Health ecosystem.
Yeah.
How does our Odyssey fit into that ecosystem as a model? And what is WeGo Health trying to achieve in addition to what you're doing with your nonprofit?
Yeah, great question. I mean, I think our Odyssey definitely can fit into WeGo Health, because what we do at WeGo Health is we work with these patient leaders. We work with over 100,000 of them to transform the way we look at the healthcare system. And I think that's what I am a big believer in. I mean, that's why I joined this very mission-driven company who wants to partner patient leaders with healthcare companies on these various projects. And so when you think about like a patient leader, it's someone perhaps like myself, right, who learned about this diagnosis, but then wanted to share my story or really just make a difference and be an advocate. And so what we do is we bring these patient leaders together across these different condition areas. We provide resources, trainings, networking opportunities, and really just, again, connect them with companies looking for insight or just collaborating and just getting their voice heard. I think that's the big thing that, keeps me passionate, is wanting to get their voices heard, but also give them the tools and resources that I didn't have, that I'm sure many other people can relate to, didn't have when they learned about a new diagnosis of where do I turn? How do I get my voice heard, whether it's public speaking, whether it's networking, whether it's, any other, ways to, make a difference in the community. And that's exactly what we're trying to do. But also, that business model of connecting patients through kind of insights or content development, or what we call influencer marketing.
Yeah, absolutely. It sounds fascinating. I love the way both of the platforms that you find yourself in are very complementary and so suitably timed in the environment that we're living in. I know we talked a little bit about COVID-19, and we're going to get into that in a few minutes, but
Yeah.
really interesting how a lot of these meetups and affiliations, associations, networking are really going online and actually doing quite well with that. And gathering a lot of also like global presence and participation. I do want to talk a few minutes around the whole diagnosis piece, especially as it relates to chronic or rare diseases, especially in the situation, as you've alluded, with Huntington's, that there isn't actually a known treatment. So let's actually talk a little bit about, is there an advantage of getting diagnosed? Why do we want people to be diagnosed? Is there a school of thought out there, which is what I don't know won't hurt me, or you only live once, the YOLO theory? What would you say to people in general if there is a family history and what have you of getting genomic testing? I'm curious about your thoughts about the rationale and potentially some of the pushback that might be coming from actual young adults in that process.
Yeah, I'll try to tackle all of that. And I think one of the biggest things, talking just about that genetic history piece, right, is how are you receiving those results, and what are you hoping to do with it? And I think it's going back to utilizing your support system, friends and family, but also your resources, such as a genetic counselor. I actually didn't go through genetic counseling, and I was very fortunate that I had that good group of friends, and eventually, years later, my family as well. But I wish I went through it because they would have made the process more manageable. So I think it's utilizing that resource of the genetic counselors, but then also eventually seeing a specialist that is knowledgeable of that condition. I think that's so important because it happens all the time, where if you go to someone and they're not as knowledgeable, are you going to get the best care that you deserve or that you need? And again, I know that there's always challenges of finding the right specialist or finding the right person. And to me, it's, you really want to find someone that's going to be willing to listen to the patients and work together, come up with a plan. The neurologist I work with, who not only specializes in HD, he does just that. And I think that's the big thing, is what I've seen in this space. And I was actually talking about this at our Odyssey meetup recently, is that there's this kind of like power dynamic, right, between doctors and patients. And I totally get it with a doctor having that background, right, that knowledge of, hey, I studied this and I'm knowledgeable of this. But how do we, again, listen to the patients and make sure that they're being believed, especially young adults, and unfortunately, especially females versus males, being believed that, hey, this is what I'm dealing with. I'm not making this up. This is my challenge. And I think that's where I would love to see more patients, being connected during med school, right? And having that part of your curriculum where, you hear that perspective, so you understand their challenges as they navigate those next steps. Now, kind of the knowing or not knowing piece of things, I think, again, that's a personal decision. If there is a family history, or if there's, if you're feeling off, right, I think it's important to figure out what's the best for your health, and doing what's best for you. But I think it's, again, being prepared and making sure you're getting the right resources. So, in my case, right, we'll talk about Huntington's disease. Imagine if I was given a list of patient advocacy organizations I could reach out to, or, hey, go check out these Facebook groups, online communities, or, hey, eventually, again, privacy permitted, I'm going to connect you to a local support group or someone else who's been in your shoes, so that you don't feel that sense of isolation. So I think those are kind of the main areas. And then also it helps with research, right? Like, the more we know and the more we're knowledgeable, the more we can hopefully help accelerate medical research and make sure that we provide access to the right care from a treatment standpoint as well.
Yeah, so lots of great things there, Seth, and so great answer on that. We're in an interesting world, and as you know, a lot of what we talk about on this podcast is really around technology and interventions in healthcare, and genomics is rocketing in the healthcare space. So much so that some people are even discussing this idea that just like getting, a social insurance number or some sort of an identifier when a child is born, that they get their genome tested,
Yeah.
and sort of being able to get into a future world of wellness care as opposed to sickness care, always knowing what each individual's personal baseline is and being able to cater and monitor and sort of get into a whole pre-analytics place of allowing people to make the right health decisions and the right food choices and the right, who knows, even geographical destination, living
Yeah.
spaces, etc. Is this science fiction? Is there a reality to that? Or is this like a really scary dystopian, oh wow, big brother is going to be surveilling the world, and there's a whole issue with people knowing, for example, that I may get such and such disease, and it's going to preclude me from doing all of the things that I could potentially think I could do.
Yeah, that's a tough one. I think like there are parts of it that you do have to be careful of. I know, you know, that it could impact you if you get a diagnosis and then it gets through your insurance and you have to pay more, or you may not be able to get access to certain things. Kind of reminds me of this like movie I remember I watched when I think I was in like middle school or high school. It's like Gattaca. And it was like, you had to have that like perfect features in order to work in a certain area. And it was like, it just came to a point where it made me think of like, okay, could that impact people who live with rare chronic conditions or just a health condition in general, that they're not going to get the same support or access to what quote unquote normal people get, or that they have to pay more, even though, for me, I say, well, why should I pay more? It's not like I asked, I woke up one day and say, oh, I hope I have this disease. And so we have to look at it from that perspective. But I think like regarding, this concept of, again, going back to knowing versus not knowing, is understanding just like where we're trying to go with technology. How do we utilize that? How do we become more aware of some of these health conditions so that we can decrease that diagnostic odyssey, from 10 to 15 years, perhaps, to 5 to 7 years, or 1 to 2 years. And then it's also, what do you do next? I mean, a perfect example for me is, and again, I mentioned this before we started, I'm an open book. And so, I was dealing with just some anxiety and have tried different anxiety medications, and then learned about this, like, it was like you have to do a mouth swab to learn about what medications work well with your body. And imagine if that was like the first thing that I did, and I got on the right medication versus switching and the side effects, right? But I think it's, when you think of it from that perspective, right, no matter what, there's not going to be a one size fits all. There's always going to be side effects. There's always going to be challenges. But how do we just, make people aware of these options, and then more importantly, make sure that they can get access to it, or afford these options, and making sure it's getting covered by their health insurance, or that they can just, figure out another financial resource to make it happen.
There's a lot for people to navigate through, and
Yeah.
unfortunately, I think in the environment, it's becoming increasingly complex. COVID-19 has turned the world upside down. There's some places geographically that are still undergoing huge impacts, others are emerging, but it's still, the pandemic continues and rears its ugly head. There's a lot of interesting things I think that we've learned in this process. And one of them has to do with people and their integration with the healthcare system, that it's a much bigger, complex system than tinkering with little bits and pieces and hoping things are going to work out. One of the other things I think that was learned here is that there's a lot of different versions of reality and of truth. And I think a lot of people's trustability, if you will, with physicians in various levels, either at government or just a healthcare agency, have been put to the test. So with all of that said, I'm curious about what learnings or what you think is happening, especially with the rare diseases types of patients or people who are still in an undiagnosed framework. Is there a concern about trusting people now? Because there's been so many different versions of what was going on with COVID-19. And do you think people are a little bit more reticent now of interacting with the healthcare system? Who are they listening to now?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's tough because when you think about just COVID-19 and how fast they were able to bring a vaccine, right? They made history, and of course, a vaccine is different from a rare disease, but it can take 10 to 15 years to get a effective treatment for a rare disease. And so when you think of it, you say, well, imagine if we spent all that time and effort or funding on these rare diseases to accelerate this process and help improve the quality of life or allow people to live a longer and healthier life. I think the one thing that I keep seeing this common area is educating. We got to, from the beginning of educating people on what it means to develop drugs. What does it mean to participate in a trial? What does it mean to just go from preclinical to phase 1 to phase 2 to phase 3? Because I think that's the big challenge, is that we sometimes people see, okay, it's in phase 1 and it's going into phase 2. Okay, here's the cure, right? This is guaranteed. And it's like, well, no, we got to see if it's, more effective in a larger sample, and making sure that that aligns with the community and we're meeting our endpoints and other, various factors. So I think it comes down to that education piece. But yeah, there is definitely a distrust, especially when it comes to when you look at, these high drug pricing and how the rate of pricing, is going up significantly higher than what people can necessarily afford to pay. But I would say, like, with that being said, how do we bring the cost of, drugs down while also not impacting negatively innovation in the rare disease space? And I know, I've learned from both sides now, from a patient, but also, also a caregiver to my mom, and now in kind of the other side of the business side of things. I understand that, whenever you're investing in anything, right, your goal is that you're going to make your money back somehow. But I think what we need to do is, like you mentioned, is trying to look at revamping this whole healthcare system. We can't just point fingers at one specific stakeholder. We got to look at all of them, right? I've never been to a conference where there's patients, caregivers, pharma, biotech companies, health insurance representatives, pharmacy, reps, public benefit managers. And I know some of these are more, I think US based, but I would love to see, how do we bring all these people together to come up with ways to improve, better access to treatments or lowering the cost of drugs while not hurting innovation. And, it's a big effort, right? I don't have the answer today, but I think it's having these conversations and just being, able to go into it with an open mind of saying, okay, well, what's the missing piece, or what is the issue that we need to solve first? Because there's just, I keep learning each day that there's more and more challenges with the healthcare system as a whole. I mean, even just separating access to care from affordability, right? Everyone technically has access, but not everyone can afford the access, which is the bigger issue. For example, right, if you look at it from a mental health standpoint, in the US, seeing a therapist out of network can cost you $100 to $200 per session. And if you're like, hey, I need to go weekly, that adds up, right? And I think for me, it's also looking at it from that perspective of saying, well, how can we fix that so that people can afford it, as well as making sure therapists are getting paid on time and paid adequate, what they deserve to get paid. And so I think, that's just one example, but that's just showing, right? Like for me, going to therapy, my options now are even more limited because I can't afford that. The other people who I can afford might have a huge wait list. And then I'm kind of like, okay, now I'm back to square one. Or, hey, this therapist I would love to see, but they work in a different state and they can't, they're not licensed in my state. So now, like, how do we even improve that with the whole telehealth experience?
Yeah, there's a lot of complexities, and I think we're just surfacing on some of the solutions, what I call systems innovation thinking, and
Mhm.
getting into this mire of complexity, because I think there's a difference between complexity and complication. So complicated, there's usually tools or solutions that are somewhere out there. Complex means it's never been determined before, and that's where I think we find ourselves. I wanted to spend a couple of minutes talking around the whole clinical trials piece and discovery and innovation. So, for diseases that don't currently have treatments, like Huntington's, is there a possibility that there's a cohort of people who find each other through these portals and meetups and groups and nonprofits and other people, and find each other and then be able to, for example, crowdsource a a situation where they almost set up their own clinical trial and start sourcing various providers or investigators? And I'm just wondering if there's going to be a day where there's a large enough need coming directly from patients where they can go in and start solving some of these issues themselves, especially in this world that we're calling decentralized trials.
Mhm.
I wanted to spend some time thinking about the empowered patient to be able to help with the whole catalyst towards identifying, either a new diagnostic or an actual treatment. And then really just asking the question of, how do we bring the players on the table? And secondly, how do we leverage really deep um, tools, machine learning, artificial
Mhm.
intelligence, quantum computing, to do really rapid prototyping and accelerate the way that we have been traditionally doing clinical trials?
Yeah, I mean, I would say there's already people in the rare disease space who have been a part of that, of trying to set up their own kind of clinical trials, because their rare disease is so rare, it's ultra rare, where they have to do like a lot of the legwork. They have to figure out investigators, and they also have to, then build the trust, right? Is this the right investigator? How much funding do we actually need for this to set this trial up? If we don't have enough, what happens if we run out of funding, right? There's all these kind of unknowns, but I've seen it, and it's great to see some of these, rare disease patients and caregivers and just advocates really trying to take it into their own hands to, accelerate this process and say, hey, we deserve a seat at the table. We deserve, to be a part of just the drug development process. And I think, I'm a big believer is, start early, start connecting with patients, caregivers, patient advocacy organizations from the beginning, preclinical, right? It's about managing those expectations. Don't say, hey, we found this cure. It's saying, hey, we're exploring this, we're trying to learn, we'd love your feedback, because that way, we educate the community more about some of the drug development, ins and outs, but then we also get their input and understand, okay, are we looking at the right endpoints? Is the trial design protocol too burdensome on the patient? I mean, if someone goes, for example, if I was to participate in a trial every other month, right? That's 6 days out of the year. But then they're like, oh, we also need to do a follow-up visit on day 12, right? It's like, okay, now I have to find, my caregiver might have to take work off, and then we have to find childcare or babysitter, versus trying to do it all in one day, or doing the whole telehealth experience or virtual experience, where we can say, hey, let's not have to bring them in all the time, and let's make sure we can, assess this. But, going to the like AI piece of it, I think the more we can gather from the community and get their perspectives, the more we can streamline this process to make it more manageable and easy, and just make it so that we can get to where we need to be faster. But also, making sure we're doing it right. So it's not about just speed all the time, but it's also about accuracy, and making sure that, again, those endpoints are what we're looking for, the design and the protocols make sense, and trying to, figure out those next steps.
Yeah, so clinical discovery and identification, especially in rare diseases, it's a really tough value proposition, as you had originally suggested, that they're very expensive to produce. There's only X number of patients. And so ultimately, how does the pharmaceutical company make their money back?
Mhm.
So it's a really interesting conundrum, but we're sort of in this new world with pharma where the big, huge blockbuster products where, basically the world goes on these drugs is no longer the case. We're now getting into these N=1 types of concoctions, remedies. We're talking about 3D printing potentially in the world where pharmacies can actually create drugs specific to a patient's dosage requirements. And I talked to somebody recently where there are implantable drugs that actually do time release. So there's all kinds of interesting innovations as it relates to this. So I'm just curious, with all of this discovery and information and confusion, who are the new thought leaders? We're in the digital world where we hear a lot about these digital thought leaders. They used to be physicians. They used to be very specific people. A lot of times pharma companies were leveraging celebrities, but we've been seeing some recent data that these celebrities may not be as effective as somebody, for example, like yourself, who actually is experiencing Huntington's disease. So my question really specifically is, how are we going to uh, really engage people in this confusing world, making them feel like there's hope and being able to navigate where some of these solutions and opportunities exist?
I would say you were kind of spot on where you're saying don't just use this celebrity or lifestyle influencer, but work with the community themselves, right? I mean, I think in my case, right, I'm part of the Huntington's disease community. If someone sees me just sharing my story and then I say, oh, go check out this resource or this educational material, or hey, this trial, they say, oh, okay, I know Seth, or oh, he just shared his Huntington's disease story. Like, I'm more likely to trust them versus you see one of those commercials and you're like, oh, it's just another celebrity, talking about this medication. And I think that's exactly what we do at WeGo Health is we're trying to make it more authentic. We work with these patient leaders because they want to sit at the table, they want to have their voice heard, but we also want to help build that trust with the patient community. And if we work with these patient leaders and advocates, the more likely we are to also build that trust with the larger community as well. And so it's I would say these thought leaders, right? There's a lot of them out there, and yes, you have the key opinion leaders, but I think it's also, and I've heard this phrase, it's not mine, but like patient opinion leader, right? These experts, these subject matter experts who are knowledgeable about their condition. They know the ins and outs of the community. They've built that trust with the community, and now they're trying to provide insight to the company, saying, "Hey, this is what we need to do to help out and make a difference." And that's how we have to really look at and value these patient leaders, and also, pay them for their insight, right? If they're giving you, this valuable information that's going to help with your, along the drug development cycle, then we need to be paying them appropriately, similarly as we pay these key opinion leaders.
We're talking a lot about the expense of healthcare and how that's only just going to start to really get larger, especially with these very expensive rare diseases, specialized biologics and products, and oncology, and the list goes on. We also are having simultaneous conversations about decentralized clinical studies to accelerate and augment discovery and innovation. And with that is this idea of having trials in a hybrid way. Sometimes people will go in because they're geographically located. Other times you can start getting people at a national level that you were never able to get into some of these clinical trials, because they've now created trials so that people can participate from a completely different part of the country or the world or what have you. So now you can bolster the numbers, especially in the rare diseases areas, with larger numbers because it's being augmented in a more holistic and more geographically inclusive manner. So my question to you is how can the decentralization and the inclusion of more patients and the potential ability to use things like patient reported outcomes, where like using things like wearables, seamless technologies, Siri, Alexa, maybe even just
Yeah.
ambient, biometrics that are, going in through your keyboard. So there's this data that's being shared into these data lakes for these decentralized trials. Would we consider one day that patients get paid, I don't know, through some sort of blockchain technology or even tokenizing? We hear a lot about NFTs or non-fungible tokens,
Yeah.
tokenizing people's data so that these individuals get paid, and maybe somehow this reduces the cost of their drugs, or it gets piled in somewhere so that insurance companies give them some sort of um, refunds or loyalty points for sharing the data. Just what are some of the possibilities that you see potentially happen with this idea of decentralization and more inclusion?
I love that idea. I mean, yeah, the data, yes, these companies might have it, but at the end of the day, it's also that's the patient's data, right? And I think, how do we, I don't want to say incentivize them, but how do we make them feel a part of it, right? And say, hey, like, this is your data and this is our goal, and we're going to make sure it doesn't impact you negatively for example, paying higher premiums for health insurance, or not getting access to life insurance, or whatever the case might be. But also in return, right, like you said, it's discounts on treatments, or better access, or trying to figure out those things. But I think it's also, when we think about just making things easier, more manageable, just it's asking them what they're looking for. So I had a friend who was in a trial, and he said one thing he wished for was access to a social worker or a therapist, right? Mental health support. We don't even think about that until, maybe after the fact, or, hey, I got to travel, so I need, help covering expenses for childcare support, or, just covering other types of expenses. And I think, the wearable piece is great. But it's also, what's kind of in it for the patient? Like, what do they get out of it? Is it like, I have a Garmin thing on, right? I can track my steps, and then I get an update of, okay, I'm doing good today. And so can we do something like that, where it gives them updates or personal goals, or works, alongside them on their healthcare, and how they approach kind of just life in general. But I would say, just, when we think about making it just more accessible, is really just kind of making it easier for the patient and caregiver. And I think one other part, and I don't know how much this relates, but again, talked with some others in the space about this, is, you see all those different online portals that these different healthcare systems have, right? And the patient ends up being the middle person, where I got to say, hey, doctor so and so, can you connect with my psychiatrist? Oh, can you connect with this specialist? And then you're trying to connect them all, and this one has one portal, this one has a different one. How do we make even that easier to navigate, where it's like, hey, I'm going to set this all up, I'm going to give you guys consent or whatever, like, that you guys can talk with each other, because it's going to make things easier for me, versus going back and forth and saying, oh, did you guys talk? Oh, no, I haven't got a hold of them. Or versus just sending them a quick message saying, hey, here's what I have a question on, versus, hey, I got to come in, do a copay, pay for this just to get one question heard. So I think there's definitely opportunities there. And same with the trials, right? How do we make it so that they can ping their trial site coordinator, say, hey, a quick question, versus coming into the building and having to take time out of their day because they didn't get their question answered.
It's brilliantly said. And, as we start to navigate, what are the actual patient's needs? It sounds to me like what we're really saying here is a certain level of interoperability, a seamlessness that makes it really easy for communication without having to go through all kinds of hoops and hulus. And so these are really good things, I think, that pharmaceutical companies are probably duly noting. COVID-19 has also had lots of really big impact on mental wellness and the whole caveat around that. I'm also curious, not only just mental wellness, and the impact that social isolation and all sorts of other things, the repropagation or the development of addictions and other sort of antisocial types of behaviors. I'm also curious about the impact it may have on individuals who had delays in treatments, diagnosis, things that they were looking for, or they actually had a genomic test and they were given something and then they had delays in being able to speak to somebody. How do you think this has impacted people with rare diseases or in general? And what do you sort of see moving forward? One of the questions that goes with that is if there is a limit, if you will, on social workers and there's the expense with it, do you also see that maybe there's been more utilization of chatbots, these little mechanisms or algorithms that have been trained on, cognitive behavioral therapy? We've heard of Wobot. There's lots of other ones that are out there. And even things like Replica, these kinds of algorithms that act like your best friend and that sort of thing. So what is your sense around the social and mental wellness that COVID has really propagated? And where do you think people are getting some of their reprieve from a mental wellness standpoint?
I still think, we have a lot of work to do when it comes to mental health. And I know it's kind of like that idea of like, oh, being patient centered, and hearing a lot of the talk about it, but what actions are actually being implemented, what policies are being implemented, especially for mental health. I mentioned to you, me finding a therapist, I had an Excel sheet of like 30 to 40 people I had to reach out to. And I remember one therapist specifically said, oh, you got to reach out to about 25 people. Like, if a therapist is telling me that, then I think there's an issue with the healthcare system in general, where it's taking people a lot longer to find it. And I know COVID probably played a role in that, but then there's that other side of it, like you said, these chat boxes, or there's these different now apps out there where you can talk with someone via texting. But to me, it's like you miss out on kind of this face-to-face interaction, whether it's through Zoom or in person. And it doesn't, I mean, at least personally for me, that's not solving it. If I want to text someone, I'm going to text my friend or family, right? I don't necessarily feel like I need to text a professional versus seeing them in person or talking with them via video chat. And so I think it's trying to figure out what your needs are and writing those down. What are you looking for when it comes to that mental health support? How can you access that? And what's currently available. I think telehealth does help. You might be able to now see people that you wouldn't typically see because they live on the other side of the state, but because of telehealth, you can still see them, because you're probably not going to drive maybe 2-3 hours just to see them now, but now you're like, hey, I can see them in, via telehealth. I think the other part, is kind of just understanding, I think when it comes to like trials, right, a lot of them might have been put on pause, or getting your kind of annual testing done, put on pause. I think 2020 was just the year of adjustments, right? We as the rare disease community know what it means to adjust. We always are adapting on the go. And I think it's just, how do we, learn from this, and then, continue to accelerate medical research. And, I wish there was this like one, step-by-step guide, but I think it's always going to be case by case. It's going to depend on the size of the rare disease population. It's going to depend on, who are those thought leaders that are really the game changers, or who are making a difference? Who are those patient advocacy organizations that are also helping, step up to the plate and saying, hey, we want to help out with this as well. And really just trying to, get back to somewhat of a sense of normalcy as we continue to get more people vaccinated, and continue to, try to, move forward with medical research.
Beautiful. I know that a lot of pharmaceutical company people who are listening to this, they already have a lot of ideas around how to connect with patient advocates, associations, groups, especially in the rare diseases, oncology, and other therapeutic spaces. As it relates to clinical trials, there's huge amount of attention that's gone into this. But in your opinion, what other unnavigated areas still exist where there is an opportunity for pharma to help with general education. A lot of times, pharma will consider education as it relates to drug treatment, but there are so many different aspects to a patient's life that I suppose pharma can help to address, such as how to talk to friends and family about your condition, um, about love and intimacy,
Mhm.
how to rate. You were mentioning about, raising a family and when and should I do this, or and I think also things like transitioning from being a young person to considered adult care. Is this different? So in your opinion, what other components of that education in a patient's condition or their journey can pharma help with all of these various non-drug related topics?
I think it starts with that co-creation of content, right? And it's asking the community, what are you guys looking for? What are the top, unmet needs? Because again, in Huntington's disease, it might be very different than in, say, lupus or multiple sclerosis or ALS or whatever the condition might be. So it's really just, rather than assuming, right? We have to simply ask. I know that there's always been the saying of build it and they'll come, and I continue to say it's not even, we got to take a step back and say, like, listen to them, build it together, and then work together to make it happen, right? I mean, I think we can't just make assumptions anymore of saying, yeah, this is what's best for our company, so we're going to do it. But what is best for the community? What are their unmet needs? How do we identify them? And it could just be as simple as, hey, we're going to run a focus group or an insights call or an advisory board or whatever the case might be, to really dive deeper into it. And I think the other aspect is, and I totally understand this piece of, like, there's a lot of red tape, right, when it comes to compliance and regulation. But I think it's, how do we come up with other ways to accelerate medical research, whether it's working with a third party, like what you guys are doing or what WeGo Health is doing, and saying, hey, we're going to help. We're going to just jump in here and help you guys capture that data, so you don't have to worry about all the compliance piece. We're going to take care of all that. And then we're also going to work with working with getting that patient voice heard throughout the whole process. But the education piece, yeah, I think it's going to depend on the community. It's going to depend on what their needs are. And then it's also working with the patient advocacy organizations to say, how can we help support these efforts? How can we, have conversations like this where we're talking about these important issues and then saying, let's brainstorm and let's discuss how we make this happen. How do we implement these ideas into action?
I love it, Seth. This is, I think, a really great positive note, I think, to end our conversation today. There are so many different dimensions. I think the possibilities are limitless in the next 5 years, and very excited to see what will progress for both our Odyssey as well as with WeGo Health. And we'll be watching on the sidelines. For anybody who's listening to this podcast and are interested in contacting, networking, or collaborating with Seth Rotberg on any of his initiatives, we will be leaving his contact details in the show notes. So please be on the lookout for that. And really, just as a tag on to what Seth has mentioned, everything starts with this conversation. So these big, hairy, audacious conversations in very complicated situations, in very complex environments, is we can't do this alone. This is actually the reason why Impetus has our asynchronous and synchronous collaboration touch points, so that you can work with a variety of stakeholders, payers, patients, allied healthcare providers, physicians, et cetera, work on some of these components, being able to reach consensus and really driving growth and opportunity and innovation we can actually help you with. So please check out impetusdigital.com. We'd also appreciate if you can like and subscribe so other people can find this content. Please feel free to leave a review for us on our podcast. We want to thank everybody for coming on, listening to the show today. Seth, thank you for a really dynamic and very interesting conversation, and wishing everybody a wonderful day ahead.